So everything I do on this channel is about the meaning contained in stories, usually fantasy or sci-fi movies or shows or whatever. And I've definitely met people who are skeptical about the usefulness of finding meaning in fiction as opposed to just enjoying it as meaningless fun. Now, something I've been enjoying doing for a while at night to help me get to sleep is listening to some audiobook versions of the original 1865 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which of course you probably recognize mostly because it has come down to us today mostly through film adaptations of various kinds. But a little bit ago, I was laying in bed, hoping to get to sleep, but also mentally taking notes on the structure of the Alice story, when I noticed a series of places where you could argue that Lewis Carroll is possibly telling a story that is intended to mock those of us who are trying to find meaning in fiction. So in this video, I'll be listing 4 of those that I noticed, and I'll talk about whether I think that's really what he's doing, and whether we should, in fact, be trying to look for meaning in fiction. Now, it's kind of funny, in the 1999 TV film Alice in Wonderland, which is a fun little film, and I've actually got a video discussing my reaction to it and specifically talking about how it expresses psychological ideas about overcoming stage fright and other forms of situational anxiety. But anyway, it's kind of funny, in that film, they redesign certain key parts of the story to make it revolve around a moral of the story, quote unquote, kind of thing, or like a main point that everything in the dream world is supposed to point to. Specifically, they make it into something about facing your fears and overcoming stage fright. It's probably not as simple as something you could just reduce to 1 or 2 lines and say the moral of the story is this, but definitely something in that ballpark. But the original story almost seems like it was actually making a mockery specifically of the idea of morals for stories. At least you could suggest that it does. And I'll get into that in a bit. But in the 1990, and that particular scene that I'm talking about where it does that, they do have that scene in the 1999 movie, but they included it a little more briefly in a little more limited form, just enough that if you're watching the movie, you'll at least notice that it's there and see that little bit of a contradiction, which I think is cool that they did that. So anyway, so in this video, I'm going to list those 4 different scenes, 2 of which belong to the sequel, The Looking Glass, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But for starters, I'm just going to talk about this one particular scene with the Duchess and consider, and perhaps you will be considering with me, whether Lewis Carroll might actually be against morals to the story kind of thing, and whether or not maybe Lewis would roll over in his grave if he knew that there was an Alice movie released in 1999 with a moral to it. So in the book, this is part of chapter 9. This is after Alice has been playing croquet with the queen. They just had the big old kerfluffle about the king wanting to behead the Cheshire Cat for being impertinent. But since the Cheshire Cat was just a floating head watching them from above at this point, the executioner insists you can't behead something unless there's a body to cut it from. And they're all arguing until Alice suggests, well, why don't we ask the Duchess, since it's her cat after all. So they go to fetch the Duchess from prison, which is where she was, awaiting beheading, because the queen said off with her head at some point off screen that we didn't see, but we know that's what happened. And once they show up with the Duchess, by that point, the Cheshire Cat has vanished. So Alice and the Duchess go for a walk together. And she's super excited to see Alice and really friendly, which is a bit of a change from last time we talked with the Duchess back at the Duchess's house in chapter 6, because back then she was fairly cranky and bad-tempered, though not entirely unfriendly. But now she's eager to go walking with Alice, presumably because she's out of prison for the moment, you know. And she starts off by saying to Alice, and from here on I'm going to be reading portions from the actual book. She says to Alice, "You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing," said the Duchess as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to see her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen, because in chapter 6 the house was full of pepper and everyone was sneezing and throwing things. So then Alice thinks, and she ponders for a minute about whether pepper just makes people angry in general, you know, because she's got dream brain where you make logical things that don't make a lot of sense, but they kind of make formal sense in a weird way. But anyway, and I'm back to reading now. This is after Alice was pondering about whether pepper just makes people angry in general. She had quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. Tut, tut, child, said the Duchess. Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it. And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like her getting so close to her. First, because the Duchess was very ugly, and second, because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin upon Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. The game's going on rather better now, she said, by way of keeping the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round." Somebody said, Alice whispered, that it's done by everybody minding their own business. "Ah, well, it means much the same thing," said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder as she added, "and the moral of that is, take care of the sense and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice said to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo," because she's holding the flamingo from the croquet game. "Shall I try the experiment?" "He might bite," Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. "Very true," said the Duchess. "Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "Only mustard isn't a bird," Alice remarked. "Right as usual," said the Duchess. "What a clear way you have of putting things." "It's a mineral, I think," said Alice. "Of course it is," said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree to everything that Alice said. "There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "Oh, I know," exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. "It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is." "I quite agree with you," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you'd like to put it more simply, never imagine yourself to be other than what it might appear to others that you were, or might have been what was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise." "I think I should understand that better," Alice said very politely, "if I had it written down, but I can't quite follow it as you say it." "That's nothing to what I could say if I chose," the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. "Pray don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that," said Alice. "Oh, don't talk about trouble," said the Duchess. "I give you a present with everything I've said as yet." A cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad they don't give birthday presents like that, but she did not venture to say that out loud. "Thinking again?" the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. "I've a right to think," said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly, and the—" But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favorite word, moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "A fine day, your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice. "Now, I give you fair warning," shouted the Queen, stamping on the ground as she spoke. "Either you or your head must be off, and that in about half no time. Take your choice." The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment. So that's that. So that's the first portion I was talking about. And so, what do you think? Is Lewis Carroll here in this particular bit of this chapter? Is he intending to mock the idea of finding meaning in stories? Or at least specifically, the idea of finding a moral in a story? That's the question, and I'm going to come back to that. But let's talk about another similar passage. Here's a passage that I don't think I've seen in most of the movie versions. I haven't seen that many movies, but it's a fun little portion. And I always love the whole court scene, because this is part of the court scene. I always love that whole court scene. And I especially love the court scene in the 1999 film, which I think, some parts of it, I think they just lived it from the book, or at least it sounds very close. But anyway, at the end of chapter 10 of the book, Alice has been hanging out with the griffin and the mock turtle when they hear a distant cry of, "The trial is beginning." So the griffin takes Alice by the hand and they hurry off to the court together. And then we have chapter 11, and it turns out that it's the Knave of Hearts who's on trial, and he's on trial for supposedly stealing the tarts. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away. And that's, the topic of the trial. And the case goes on. Various characters from earlier in the story end up coming to the stand, which is absolutely great fun. And one of my favorite parts in that 1999 movie is when the Mad Hatter and the Hare come to the stand, and it's just amazing. It's wonderful. But then in chapter 12, still in the court scene, they bring in a piece of evidence, which is a letter supposedly written by the Knave of Hearts, supposedly. The king says to read the letter, and it says, and now I'll read from the book again. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin, your majesty? He asked. Begin at the beginning, the king said gravely, and go on till you come to the end. Then stop. There was dead silence in the court, whilst the White Rabbit read out these verses. They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone, we know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her one, they gave him two, you gave us three or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me. That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet, said the king, rubbing his hands. Now, let the jury... If any one of them can explain it, said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. If any one of them can explain it, I'll give him a sixpence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. The jury all wrote down on their slates. She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it, but none of them attempted to explain. If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves a world of trouble, as we needn't try to find any. And yet I don't know, he went on, spreading out the verses on his knee and looking at them with one eye. I seem to see some meaning in them after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you? He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like it? He said, which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard, because he's a card like the other cards, unlike in the 1999 movie. All right, so far, said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself. We know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. If she could push the matter on, that must be the queen. What would become of you? What indeed? I gave her one, they gave him two. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, But it goes on, they all returned from him to you, said Alice. Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. Nothing could be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit, you never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen. Never, said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. And then anyway, after that point, things kind of escalate until the queen finally says, off with your head, about Alice. And that's when Alice says, you're nothing but a pack of cards. And a minute later, as things kind of swirl around and all that, and a minute later, she wakes up. And then there's a couple pages left as kind of an epilogue-ish kind of thing in the waking world. And then the story's over. But once again, here's the question. What do you think? Is Lewis Carroll mocking those of us who try to find meaning in things? Here's a poem, and it's quite obvious that there's not an atom of meaning in it, as Alice says. But this pretentious and absurd character, the king, just looks a little closer and reads it over again and again, and he can find meaning in it, but it's not because the meaning is there. Is Carroll saying to all of us, quit doing that, quit trying to find meaning? So I said I was going to talk about 4 of these. Well, the third one takes place in the second book, which is called Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, which was also published in 1865. And in this story, it's another dream, but instead of starting with Alice following the white rabbit into the rabbit hole, instead it starts with Alice stepping through a mirror or through a looking glass in the old language that they use there. And she finds herself in Looking Glass World, as they call it. I think the second book, for me at least, seems a little bit more dry, a little less fun than the first book, with the exception maybe of the opening chapter, which I think is pretty cool, and some other key points throughout it. But you could also say it's more witty and more verbose than the first book, and a lot of movie adaptations of Alice in Wonderland include elements from book 2, such as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. But anyway, near the end of chapter 1, we come to the Jabberwocky bit, which I think is pretty cool. Here's how it goes. There was a book lying near Alice on the table, and while she sat watching the White King, this is the White King from Game of Chess, and then I skip a little bit, she turned over the leaves, and I'm assuming that means pages. She turned over the leaves to find some part that she could read. For it's all in some language I don't know, she said to herself. It was like this. She puzzled over this for some time, but at last a bright thought struck her. Why, it's a looking-glass book, of course. And if I hold it up to a glass, the words will all go the right way again. This was the poem that Alice read. Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wade. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub-jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood awhile in thought. And as in uffish thought he said, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh, Calais, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. It seems very pretty, she said when she had finished it, but it's rather hard to understand. You see, she didn't like to confess, even to herself, that she couldn't make it out at all. Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are. However, somebody killed something, that's clear at any rate. But oh, thought Alice, suddenly jumping out, if I don't make haste, I shall have to go back through the looking-glass before I have seen what the rest of the house is like. Let's have a look at the garden first. She went out of the room in a moment and ran down the stairs, or at least it wasn't exactly running, but a new invention for getting downstairs quickly and easily, as Alice said to herself. She just kept the tips of her fingers on the handrail and floated gently down without even touching the stairs with her feet. Then she floated on through the hall and would have gone straight out the door in the same way if she hadn't caught hold of the doorpost. She was getting a little giddy with so much floating in the air, and was rather glad to find herself walking again in the natural way. And then that's the end of the chapter. So what do you think? Is Carol making fun of the search for meaning? This one, I think, feels less like that. You can probably get more sense of the direction I'm going with my discussions here. But one way that you could interpret it, at least if you looked at it that way, could be to suggest that Alice is silly for trying to find meaning in Jabberwocky. Obviously, that's not how I see it. And once I talk about the fourth one, then we can start drawing all these together. Now, the fourth one is really a very natural follow-up to Jabberwocky, just because Alice actually mentions Jabberwocky in this scene, in this conversation with Humpty Dumpty, which happens in chapter 6, so a good ways further into the book. Now, it takes a while to get to the part of the Humpty Dumpty conversation. It takes a while to get to the part of that where Jabberwocky comes up. But the idea of talking about finding meaning in things is definitely going on from the beginning of that conversation. So let's just start right at the beginning of the chapter. I'll just skip a line or two and then jump right in. When she had come within a few yards of it, the egg, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and a mouth, and when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. They've got Humpty Dumpty in all caps, so it's like, When she came to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. It can't be anyone else, she said to herself. I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on the top of a high wall, and such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance. And as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure after all. And how exactly like an egg he is, she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. It's very provoking, Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, to be called an egg. Very. I said you looked like an egg, sir, Alice gently explained. And some eggs are very pretty, you know, she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment. And then I'll skip a little bit here, and then Alice kind of talks to herself a little bit, and then we jump in here. Don't stand chattering to yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. But tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but it's a stupid name enough, Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape, almost. And then I'll skip a pretty long portion there. And then Humpty says, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get birthday presents. Certainly, said Alice, and only one for birthday presents, you know. That's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant, there's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be mastered, that's all. Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, what you mean? And then he explains, and then Alice says, that's a great deal to make one word mean, Alice said in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work like that, said Humpty Dumpty, I always pay it extra. Oh, said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. And then I'll skip a little bit more, and then we come to the Jabberwocky part, which is when things get interesting. You seem very clever at explaining words, sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem Jabberwocky? Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all the poems that were ever invented, and a good deal many that haven't been invented just yet. This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, while mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrave. That's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. And then Humpty just goes on making up definitions for all the various words and giving these extended explanations, which are just really weird and don't sound a bit like they probably have anything to do with the poem. And then finally he says, who's been repeating all that hard stuff to you? I read it in a book, said Alice. And then they go on talking about poetry and sayings and stuff like that for a long time. Alice shares some spoken poems that she heard from other characters in the Wood-Looking Glass world and Humpty Dumpty, and they talk about it. When Alice finally leaves, this is when Humpty Dumpty just finished saying how if they meet again, he probably wouldn't recognize her because she looks just like everyone else, and it would work better, quote, if you had 2 eyes on the same side of the nose, for instance, or the mouth on top. Now that would be some help. It wouldn't look nice, Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, wait till you've tried. Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said goodbye once more, and getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away. But she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, of all the unsatisfactory, she repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say, of all the unsatisfactory people I ever met. She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. And then that's the end of the chapter. So these are the four parts of the Alice story, like I mentioned, which are fascinating to think about in light of the question of whether we ought to be looking for meaning in fiction. And like I said a little bit ago, I was just kind of laying in bed at night, listening to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And I heard that portion about, particularly this was the part about in book one, where the king was trying to find meaning in that poem at the Knave's trial. And I started to think about how these four scenes, because I had them all in my head and I kind of thought through them all, and I kind of noticed how they all kind of come together, and they have this interesting way of giving us food for thought about the relationship between art forms like stories and poems and meaning, or the search for meaning, or the assigning of meaning, or the discovery of meaning, or babbling on and on about meaning, or babbling on and on about morals. So here's what I concluded. And I'm basically just going to go through my original jot notes that I jotted down in the middle of the night there. I modified them just a little bit to make them make a little more sense. And basically these notes it's kind of like a little mini essay that I wrote, which goes in order, starting with the scene with the Duchess talking about morals, then it goes to the scene with the king about the poem, and then it goes on to Jabberwocky, and then it goes to Humpty Dumpty. So what I wrote was, is Alice against finding meaning in literature? In other words, is the Alice story a satire that mocks the idea of finding meaning in literature? And then I put number one, the Duchess, all obsessed with finding morals, but she's literally just blathering. So Alice, kind of like a confused school child, which is kind of what she is. And the only word that registered to Alice from everything the Duchess said about morals and stuff, and presumably the Duchess is a real life character type that Alice, in her dream state, she's now remembering / reflecting / recreating from real life into her dream, because that's how dreams work most of the time. But anyway, so the only word in all the blathering from the Duchess, the only word that Alice really understood was the word moral. Because remember how she said, how fond she is of finding morals in things. You know, it's kind of like, that's all she got. Like all this going on, and wow, she really likes finding morals, doesn't she? But Alice never knew what any of them meant or what on earth they had to do with the subject matter, which, you know, of all the various subject matters that they were supposedly connected to. And so maybe that's kind of like in many schools and in much adult child conversation, when literary concepts are emphasized, but they remain opaque to the kids who are hearing the poorly explained and complicated descriptions. Or maybe to when literary concepts are forced in such dreadfully heavy-handed manners, let's say in school, for example, so heavy-handedly and like that they become entirely incoherent to young minds, leaving the child with nothing to take away except, my, she is dreadfully fond of finding morals in things. In such a case, where that's the way talking about meaning in things goes, in such a case, one would be better to leave the enterprise untapped entirely, because the enterprise is almost interchangeable with absurdity or nonsense, at least from the little girl point of view. Incidentally, the Alice story has no simplistic morals to be found. And while little morals could be impressed onto it, here or there or anywhere, simply because, as the Duchess says, there's a moral to everything if you can just find it, you know. But that kind of simplistic and heavy-handed moralizing is simply disrespectful to the medium. That's my personal suggestion here. That maybe that's partly what Lewis Carroll is thinking, and that's certainly something I would say, that is forcing these morals onto things in this kind of simplistic, heavy-handed dot to dot to dot to dot to dot, keeping on doing it for every little bit, doing that pedantically or obsessively becomes just a much of a buzz and a clatter, kind of like Alice's babbling teacher or aunt or whoever it is from her waking life that she's now in her unconscious mind is now replicating and doing, making the Duchess out of. So that's one way of looking at it. Or maybe you could say, just more simply, maybe Carol is just making fun of the idea of finding meaning in a story. Except if he is, then he would be a bit hypocritical, because that very observation, if that's what he means here, then that very observation would be, in that situation, that would be an implicit message contained within a story, meaning within a story, waiting to be noticed. So maybe we could say instead, rather than saying that he's contradicting himself, by containing meaning in a passage of a story that is saying we shouldn't be looking for meaning because that's stupid, rather than saying that, maybe we could instead say, maybe rather than mocking the idea of meaning being in stories, maybe he's mocking specifically finding morals in a story. Or even more likely, as I see it, kind of like how I described it above, maybe he is really wittily painting a portrait of just the absurd clucking that is all a child hears when adults babble on and on to pedantically share the results of excessive and joy-sucking moralizing. They're just trying to pile up moral after moral in mechanical and overly systematized ways, and just sucks the life out of things. And maybe as well, part of what's going on is kind of using a creative product in a way that has little or nothing to do with what it actually communicates. Number two, during the court case, after the poem is read, Alice, as she grows braver and at the same time grows physically larger, some kind of, I think, a symbolic pairing there, like growing bigger has something to do with getting older and more confident, or at least definitely the getting braver part. But anyway, after the poem is read, Alice, as she grows braver and physically larger, she declares that the poem is meaningless, which is a natural thing for a dreamer to say in her dream when she has just heard a bunch of words that supposedly prove something horrible, but they just don't. And in fact, they mean nothing of the sort to her, or anything at all of any sort, which doesn't make sense if the words were created by her unconscious mind in a dream. And the point, as generated in her dream state, was not for them to say something in particular, but simply to be things that only supposedly condemn, but actually fail to do so. So it makes sense that they come out as meaningless if they're generated by her unconscious mind to play the role of words that supposedly mean something bad, but don't. But anyway, so Alice finds the connection to be just absurd, and like there's no meaning in these at all. But the king, like any pretentious investigator, continues to read them over and over. And before Alice knows it, the king is triumphantly producing parallels and commonalities that fraudulently, or at least unexpectedly from Alice's point of view, fraudulently provide meaning that happens to serve the king's agenda. Surprise, surprise. So once again, in this story, the villain and the buffoon is the one who insists something has meaning when Alice can plainly see it does not. Once again, we could ask, is Carol mocking those who look for deeper meaning in a text when others say it is meaningless? Or, on the other hand, is he actually mocking those who make a pretense and do so with dogmatism in order to serve absurd political agendas in the pretentious name of finding things that actually aren't there to be found at all? After all, if we are talking about the topic of finding a literary point within a literary work, then certainly we would hope that Carol thinks that his own literary point, if he has one in this scene, whatever it is, hopefully we would think that Carol thinks that his own literary point would certainly be worth seeing and noticing, but not worth twisting in order to convict the Knave of Hearts. Number three, next we have Jabberwocky. Sometimes we can read and seem to appreciate on a seemingly ineffable level, seem to appreciate a work that we actually don't understand at all. Something which many of us can relate to if we've ever tried, maybe when we were kids, tried to read poetry that was substantially above our level, or listen to a piece of music maybe while only being able to make out half of the words, but still thinking we have a sense of what the words are saying, what the song is saying. Or saying yes when you're a kid and when an adult asks you what a word means and saying yes, but really only having a vague idea that you could express maybe in colors or facial expressions or fuzzy contact words, but you would totally fail on every try for a definition. I remember one time when I was a kid and someone, I forget who it was, but someone in my family, I think it was, asked me if I knew what the word ominous meant. I'm like, oh yeah, I know that word. And he or she asked me, I think it was my dad, but I'm not sure. But anyway, whoever it was asked me, okay, well, what does it mean? And I started saying, it's kind of like, because I remembered where I knew the word from. It was from this mystery book where they're in this cave and there was this ominous sound, So I'm like, yeah, ominous. It's kind of echoey, kind of, and like almost like spooky, but not really spooky, but like kind of echoey, and it's just kind of. And I knew what the word felt like. I knew the word, and I felt very offended when I was told that I was wrong. And I was told, no, it actually means that it gives you the feeling that something bad is going to happen. So it has nothing to do with echoing or anything of the sort. But I knew what the word ominous felt like, because the word ominous felt like you're in the cave and it's kind of, oh, wow. And yeah, that actually is what ominous feels like. So that's related to the meaning. And I picked that all up from context, and I wasn't crazy, but I was also wrong, because that's not what the word ominous means. The word ominous literally just means nothing about the vibe. That's all just connotative. The word just means, gives you the feeling that something bad's going to happen. So you can hear a page of a beautiful story you don't understand, and you can love it and feel comfort and joy and wonder by hearing it read. But then when someone asks you what it means or what happened in the story, you don't have a single coherent thing to say. But that doesn't mean you got nothing from it. It just means you couldn't get that one most superficial layer that adults think you must get in order to appreciate something. Because meaning actually operates on many levels. And Jabberwocky is certainly not meaningless. It's not meaningless if we interpret it as a dream-generated version of, let's say it's supposed to be the way what Alice's mind has created is a dream version of when a girl like Alice finds a poem written in English, but at a higher level with a larger vocabulary than the dreamer, which is how Alice interprets it. That's how she understands it. And for us as adults, we get to experience that because Lewis Carroll put in words that we don't know either. And there's no way we could know it because there's no dictionary that they're in. So we're kind of, when we read the story, we get to be put down to Alice's level, and we get to know what it feels like to read a poem, like every kid does at some point, and feel like you understand it, even though you don't know half the words. So anyway, if that's how we understand it, then Jabberwocky is certainly not meaningless. Nor is it meaningless, on the other hand, even if no one knows the vocabulary. So if we, take it from that and take it instead, if we look at it as a poem that actually has nonsense words in it, which is basically what Lewis Carroll technically did. He just made a poem and put in some nonsense words. But even if we look at it that way, it's also still not meaningless, even from that angle, because the words speak connotatively, even within that very ambiguous, hazy context. Which is why kids, reading kids' books that are a little above their level, kids reading those books feel like they are reading the story, even when they're on that one really difficult page, when they couldn't tell you what actually happened as far as the plot twists go, because 60% of the key words are outside of the kid's vocabulary. And I remember having that happen to me a couple times as a kid, when there's a particular part of the page when it's kind of annoying because there's a plot twist and I actually don't know what happened, and then as I grew older, I realized the reason I didn't get it was because a couple of the very most important words were outside of my vocabulary. So I could understand a lot of the words and I could understand what was going on, but then suddenly, clearly something happened and I don't know what it was. And the reason is because there's just this little part, this very important part, which uses words I don't understand. But even on a page like that, it still feels like they're reading the book. And they still got something, just not the most important parts. Number 4, finally, we have Humpty Dumpty, which is the obvious thing to bring up in connection with Jabberwocky, just because they actually go together in the story. Humpty Dumpty talks about Jabberwocky, even though there's like 5 chapters that go in between there. But So far we've seen in book one, we saw some jovial contempt for the kind of attention to moralizing that ends up becoming just endless pedantic babbling. And the kind of meaning seeking that with the king, the kind of meaning seeking that just rereads something over and over until you're able to find some absurd parallels that serve the seeker's purpose. And then in book two, we've seen the propensity with Jabberwocky, we've seen the propensity that we have to think that we understand something just because we got through it. You know, we made it through and we received some kind of feeling or some limited level of understanding, even though it's actually completely out of our league or not made for us, or even maybe contains some actual absurdities. So it's natural for the next step with Humpty. It's naturally the next step for Humpty to simply insist that he can make his words mean whatever he wants them to mean, and that he can, in fact, also make other people's words mean whatever he wants them to mean. Because Humpty supposedly understands every word of Jabberwocky, which is similar, not the same, but similar to Alice in terms of Alice thinking that she understood Jabberwocky. You know, early on, she didn't want to admit that she didn't understand it, and she kind of felt like she did understand it. But the difference is that if you were to ask Alice about some particular thing, she would kind of stumble and she would realize and she would admit she doesn't actually get it entirely. But for Humpty, instead of stumbling, what he does is he just proudly proclaims his knowledge, or rather his concoction. Because for Humpty, the truth is what he creates rather than what he finds. Just like the Duchess and the king, Humpty is here playing the fool as a mockery, as a great joke for us to be amused with. Carol's chance to mock the pursuit of meaning in one more mock-worthy manner. This time, not by the pedantic moralizing of the Duchess, not by the self-serving pretend searching of the king, but instead just by this guy who declares that meaning is whatever he wants it to be, and no one else has the right to tell him what the words mean. So it seems that far from wanting to get away from meaning, Carol here, it seems, is actually wanting to get us closer to meaning, but not just any old meaning, depending how the declarer is feeling, depending what he wants to say and declare that brillig means this time. But of these four characters, the one character of the four that I've listed here, the one character that Carol doesn't seem to be mocking is Alice, when Alice reads Jabberwocky and thinks she understands it. Carol doesn't mock Alice by painting her and making her seem absurd and maddeningly annoying, like he did with the Duchess and the king and Humpty Dumpty. Instead, he makes her relatable and even makes you want to admire her. And maybe that's because Carol knows that Alice actually is you and me, and he would do well not to mock his readers. Because we are going to read the Alice stories and think we understand them, when all we've done is read a poem filled with big words outside our vocabulary and say we like how it made us feel, and begin to start making guesses at what a slithy tove actually is after all the while fooling ourselves enough to think that we have already got the most important points just by reading it through one time in a bit of a rush. No, Lewis Carroll doesn't want to mock that. Because just like Alice when she read Jabberwocky, we have got something when we read it through and say we like how it made us feel and all that. You know, we have got something. We've got some meaning because it's there. But whether or not we've really got the point or not, who knows? Probably not. Certainly not at first. But that's not something he wants to mock. That's something he wants to console. So those are my thoughts on whether Alice in Wonderland is a satire against finding meaning in fiction. If you want to hear more conversations about meaning in fantasy and sci-fi, such as concepts, themes, and psychological and philosophical nuances, etc. All that kind of stuff. Then go ahead and hit subscribe. See you in the next one.